Hello, everybody. Today we're going to continue our discussion of organismal biology, that is the biology of organisms, talking about the variety of major body organ systems that animals have. We're going to come back to plants later, and we're also going to come back to the somewhat more complicated versions of these systems that vertebrates have in a few weeks as well. So this is going to be a quick overview of some of the most important body organ systems. Remember that in large organisms, they need to have separate organ systems to do different jobs in the body. And then all of those resources are going to be shared somehow, usually via a circulatory system. So we're going to cover circulation, respiration, osmoregulation and excretion, digestion, and basic immune system functions in this lecture. We'll come back to nerve and muscle tissue systems in another lecture as well, because they deserve a lot more time and attention. All right, so circulation is going to be moving body substances around our circulatory system. We think of it as being our heart and our blood vessels and our blood. The respiratory system does gas exchange for animals. That's going to be oxygen in and CO2 out. And we think of our primary structure for that as the lungs. Osmoregulation and excretion is homeostasis of the amount of water and solutes in the bloodstream and in the body overall. Excretion is moving to the outside of the body or getting rid of bodily waste products. In most organisms, osmoregulation and excretion are done together, so we talk about them together. The best way to get rid of water-soluble molecules that you don't want is to wash them out of the body with some water. Digestion is the next body system that we'll talk about, taking in food and processing it, breaking it down in order to be able to absorb the food into the cells of the body and getting rid of the leftover undigested food waste. And finally, a very brief introduction to the immune system. Now, all organisms, whether they're single-celled, multi-celled, plants or animals, fungi, bacteria, have some ability to protect themselves from other organisms. The vertebrate immune system is incredibly sophisticated, complicated, has multiple redundant parts, is top of mind for everybody right now because we are in the pandemic with COVID-19. We're all thinking about transmissibility of diseases and inherent immunity versus vaccinations and how long do they last and how do they work. So again, we'll come back to the more complicated vertebrate immune system, but all organisms have what we'll call innate immunity. And we'll talk about these basic types of responses. All right, here is our basic blob animal. And this is just to remind you that we have these different body organ systems. Remember that cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up organ systems, and organ systems put together make up organisms, right? And each level in this hierarchy can do something that each one below it can't do, right? So for example, one muscle cell can't cause blood to be distributed around the body, but all of the muscle cells in the heart, an organ, can pump together and move that blood around the body. So I like to think about that way we build organisms up from cells is thinking about how we build sports leagues up from individual players. We have an individual person by themselves. They can juggle the soccer ball, they can hit it against the wall. They can't do too much. We get a few of their friends together and they can have some small games. You know, we get a little more complicated in what we can do some drills, right? But we can't really have a competition until we get a whole team together. And in fact, we need to have more than one team, right? And in fact, right, so a player is going to be part of a team, and then the team is going to be part of a league with many teams, right? So we can't have a tournament unless we have multiple teams playing together in our league, right? So a team can do something a player can't by themselves. A league can do something a team can't by itself. Pretty much the same way our organ systems can do things in the body that an organ or a tissue can't do by itself. And when we think about the whole organism, all of those organ systems have to work together. So we have in larger organisms, especially in the terrestrial environment, a waterproof outer coating. And then we have the three most sort of basic internal functions that interact with the outside environment, right? We have to get something from outside the body and bring it into the body. The respiratory system is going to do that with gases. So we have to have some way for those gases to actually cross a cell membrane and get inside a cell, right? So a molecule hasn't gone from the outside environment into the body until it's crossed a cell membrane. Where is that cell membrane in mammals? It's in the lining of the lung. We'll see that other organisms actually have their whole body surface can absorb oxygen. So we need to do exchange with the environment. That is, we take something from the environment and put something from the body out. Digestion is the same way. We're going to take in food into the mouth. It's going to go down the tubing of our digestive tract. We're going to be able to move those molecules across a cell membrane, across the lining of the digestive tract. And so that food molecule gets moved from this tube that's continuous with the outside environment into a cell and then into the rest of the organism. Any extra leftover waste products are going to go out the anus. The other system that is in contact with the external environment is to get rid of stuff, right? So the excretory system, notice that it's fastened to or connected with the circulatory system. So we have molecules that are moving around the inside of the body of the animal that we don't want. They're extra if we want to maintain homeostasis for salt, for example, for sodium, and we've just eaten some really salty snacks. All right, that sodium, extra sodium is extra. We don't want it. It makes our sodium concentration too high. We're going to pump it out into the excretory system so that we can pee it away with our urine. All right, that's also useful for molecules that are poisonous or toxic to the body that we want to get rid of as well. All right, and then the circulatory system, again, in large organisms, we need to have a dedicated circulatory system so that we can move around in the organism, all these different things. We've got to get food molecules from the gut to all the other cells in the body that need them. Same thing with oxygen and getting rid of wastes. All right, so we want to think about all of these body systems working together in concert. We'll come back again to talk about the nervous and endocrine systems that help regulate and coordinate the activities of these body systems. All right, starting with circulatory systems. When we have small, flat, thin, aquatic and marine organisms, we're going to see that they may be able to do their exchange that they need to directly with the environment. All right, so we're going to have the sort of the outside of the body and the inside of the body. It's not that far apart. There's nowhere in their body that's very far. And so they don't need a circulatory system if diffusion is going to work, right? So they have gas exchange across the surface of their body because they have enough of it in contact with the external environment. That higher oxygen concentration on the outside environment is going to mean oxygen diffuses, goes down its concentration gradient to move into the tissues of the body. Same thing with carbon dioxide. If it builds up in the organism, it'll have a higher concentration in the cells that are in contact with the water around it. Carbon dioxide will move by diffusion to the external environment, right? So we don't need to have a specialized circulatory system or respiratory system in some organisms, right? So diffusion can only rapidly and efficiently move substances very far. So when we start getting organisms that are larger, we'll see that they have a set of tubing that is intended to forcefully move body fluids around from one location to the other in the body. And there are two basic versions of a circulatory system. All right, we'll cover those in one sec. There's three parts to a circulatory system. There is a pump. There are fluid vessels, and there is the fluid itself. Right, so the pump is going to have some kind of muscle cells or tissue around it. And as those muscles contract, they're going to create high pressure on the fluid that is going to push it away from the location where the muscle contractions are. There's a wide variety of things across the animal kingdom that we're going to call hearts, right? We imagine our heart, it isn't exactly heart-shaped, but it's kind of this big lump of muscle with these 4 chambers inside of it. That is not the most important thing about what makes a heart a heart. The most important thing that makes a heart is that it has muscular contractions, the purpose of which is to move the body fluid for the function of circulation. All right, so some animals that are still small enough and have a fluid-filled body space or saloon inside them, if that space is small enough, they may not actually need to have a heart at all. So if we imagine a small worm, a very, very small worm, only 1,000 cells, like a nematode worm like C. elegans, it has a little open space along the middle of its body. As the worm is wiggling, right, it's sort of going to squish all that body fluid around back and forth. And it's small enough that that is enough circulation so that things get to where they need to go, right? But for organisms that are larger, we're going to have this dedicated system with a pump and with tubing, right? Long, skinny component parts that connect the heart to other parts of the body. So if we have blood, we call these blood vessels, but not all organisms have blood. It turns out that we may have a fluid that's going to serve in the circulatory system, but it is not separated, right? So when we have a circulatory system like the one of the earthworm on the right, it is what's called a closed circulatory system. So if you imagine this blue area around the circulatory system as being the organism, notice that this creates 2 spaces. It creates a space that is inside the circulatory system. Those tubes are continuous and connected to one another, and that the fluid, the blood, is going to be flowing around and around inside the tubes, and that the fluid that's outside the tubes is different. It's not the same thing as blood because it's in a different space, a different compartment in the body. All right, so we already talked about that idea of interstitial fluid being this fluid that fills up the spaces in the body. There's not that many spaces, but there is a little space in between the cells. This interstitial fluid is going to be a liquid that has essentially the same chemical composition as the blood plasma, the watery part of the blood, but the blood is going to have cells inside of it. All right, so red blood cells, white blood cells, a whole bunch of different kinds of things. And those are unique and special to the blood. Some of them are found in interstitial fluid as well, but mostly these cellular components are going to be in the blood. That makes it blood, right? It's got that liquidy part called plasma, right? That plasma has the same water and molecules that this interstitial fluid does. Okay, so where we have a closed circulatory system, that means the blood is supposed to stay inside of it. And that allows there to be these forceful muscular contractions that are going to push the blood around through the blood vessels rapidly and efficiently. Our other example of how circulatory systems are structured is called an open circulatory system. And it's different from a closed because instead of being a continuous loop, there's basically only these vessels for part of the way around the body. So there's going to be openings to these vessels, and fluid can get into them and out of them different ways depending on what kind of organism it is, but they're only going to carry this body fluid through part of the body, right? So we still have organisms that have to be fairly small in order for this type of circulatory system to work. So it's kind of halfway in between having no circulatory system and just letting muscular contractions of the overall body squish the fluid around. It has powerful muscular contractions over part of the area of the body or the length of the body. And that creates sort of these little circulatory vortexes, whatever, around this body space, this fluid-filled body space. All right. So we don't have two different fluids here. We don't have blood versus interstitial fluid. We just have one fluid. We can't distinguish it. All right. And we call it hemolymph. We'll talk later about invertebrates, the lymph system, right? The lymph system is sort of a third kind of body fluid, kind of second kind of tubing, a third kind of body fluid that we find inside of the lymph vessels. And so this hemolymph is a way of saying it's kind of this intermediate fluid. So we find this open circulatory system in arthropods, example such as this grasshopper. We also find it in mollusks. Closed circulatory system we find in annelids like this earthworm. We also find it in vertebrates like ourselves. All right, so main components again of our circulatory system is some kind of muscular pump, some kind of tubing or vessels to move the fluid around, and then the fluid itself. And we have two major versions of how those systems work, either an open system or a closed system. All right, moving on to respiratory systems. Respiratory structures are going to have to be in contact with the environment. And when we have a watery environment, whether it's marine or freshwater, it's easy to make sure that your respiratory structures stay moist. They can be large, elaborate, they can be on the outside of the body. And the main idea of what we need to do in order to get enough oxygen into the body is that we need to have a high surface area. So we're going to have lots of these little convolutions. We're going to have frilly, feathery looking structures. We're going to have extensions sticking out of the body in marine aquatic environment. And we usually call these structures are either going to be gills, some other kind of little structures or little nubs, different kinds sticking up. Annelid worms have these parapodia. They're sort of like paddles that stick out at the sides of the worm that are part of their gas exchange system. A lot of marine organisms are going to have gills. And then echinoderms have these little like sort of just projections of their, as part of their circulatory system that are going to extend into the water, including their tube feet. Right, so they're going to be using this, basically whatever part of their surface is in contact with the water, they're going to be using it for gas exchange. All right. So this, either the gills or the body's surface are going to be the actual site where the gas exchange happens. And that's going to be called a respiratory surface. All right, so the respiratory surface is the actual structure where the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange happens. All right, it has to have this high surface area. It's an epidermal structure, so it's made of epidermal cells. It is a thin layer of cells, and it has to be moist, right? Oxygen can't diffuse into cells that are covered with any kind of protective structure, dead protein reinforced cells like our skin. They have to actually be live cells with a cell membrane that's in contact. But remember that live cells need to have moisture covering them. If we're in a marine or aquatic environment, that's no problem. When we move into a terrestrial environment, either organisms need to stay in a moist environment. They're going to secrete mucus across their outer body surface. So an earthworm uses its body surface as a respiratory surface. And if you pick one up and you think, ew, it's slimy, right? It has secreted mucus across its surface on purpose so that its body surface stays moist. Those cells are alive and they are absorbing oxygen. The other thing we're typically going to see is if the organism has a closed circulatory system, those small little tiny blood vessels that extend to all of the places in the body that need oxygen or are getting rid of carbon dioxide, those are called capillaries. And we're going to see usually that those capillaries are right up against the back of this surface, right? So we have outside environment out here, we have a watery surface, we have a thin layer of cells, the oxygen can pass through, and it can get picked straight up on the other side by capillaries. All right, the other thing an organism may need, right, especially if it has a high metabolic rate, it's more active, is some way of making sure enough oxygen is getting across its respiratory surface. In a marine environment, this may not be very important because there's a huge ocean out there and there's plenty of oxygen in it for slow moving organisms with low metabolic rate. But where we have a higher metabolic rate organism or in a terrestrial environment, we need a way to move that oxygen delivering substance back and forth or out and in of the structure. So we talk about that as ventilation. All right. Ventilation, we often talk about, oh my gosh, open a window. We need more ventilation in here. All right. And what that represents is air movement into and out of the room. Well, ventilation is going to be air or water movement across the respiratory surface. And animals are able to do that. Sometimes they live in an environment where they just sit there and the water flows across them. But they're going to need to be able to use muscular contractions sometimes in order to pump the water across their respiratory surface, or in the terrestrial environment to move air into and out of this semi-enclosed moist environment. So we have a lung. The respiratory surface is sort of on the inside surface of this sac-like structure. And we move air into that space and out of that space. And that movement of the air back and forth is ventilation of our respiratory surface. All right. So this idea of ventilation is moving air or water across our respiratory surface. In the aquatic environment, there's less concentration of oxygen than there is in the terrestrial environment, right? So air has about 20% oxygen, so that's a lot. In water, in aquatic environments, it's less than 10%. And the higher the temperature, the lower the oxygen concentration can get. All right, so if we have a very large active fish moving around in the aquatic environment, it wants to try and maximize the amount of oxygen that it's getting, because this can be, it can be hard to get enough. And so we see again in animal evolution, the invention of a structure that uses counter current flow, right? Counter current means we have two flows moving in opposite directions from one another. And we had an example of this in our thermal regulation example of a goose standing with its foot on ice, right? And we had blood as it's flowing down to the foot, it's going away from the warm body. If it just got cooled off by that foot and it would move back up towards the heart cold, that would be bad. It would cool off the animal too much. Right, so the only thing we have to do is have the two veins, the vein and the artery, going towards the foot and then back towards the heart. We have to have them next to one another. And what's going to be exchanged, or what's going to flow in that system, is heat. Right? So the heat from the body is going to flow to the venous side and warm the blood as it's returning to the body. We're going to do the same thing in this example with the fish gill. Now, its three-dimensional structure is very complicated. So I want you to focus on kind of just this part of the diagram here. If you do have a chance to look at the microscopic structure of a fish gill, it's pretty neat. But it's arranged so that there's this incredibly high surface area with the oxygen poor blood coming from the back of these little sort of circular disc-shaped things, if you zoom in close enough on a fish gill, right? So the oxygen poor blood, shown in blue, is going to be coming from the back. Right? As it flows through the capillaries towards the front, it's going in the opposite direction of the water flowing over the gills, because as the fish is swimming, the water is going to be flowing from front to back over its gills. The water with the highest oxygen concentration is going to be towards the front. The blood with the lowest oxygen concentration is going to be towards the back. And the point of having them running opposite one another is that the oxygen concentration is highest towards the front of the fish. But as the oxygen starts to diffuse into these capillaries, even as the concentration of oxygen is getting lower and lower, because some has moved into the capillary, it's going towards this end of the blood vessel that has the lowest concentration. So it causes there to be a gradient that exists between the blood and the water across the longest extent possible, which allows the maximum amount of diffusion into the capillary. All right, so this is another example of this genius arrangement of two tubes with fluid flowing in them in opposite directions that maximize the transport of something from one to the other. Right? Human engineers use this method too in things like air conditioners and heaters. All right, so when we look around at all of the different kinds of terrestrial organisms, we find that in mammals, we have a lung, and we'll come back to it later on when we talk about vertebrates some more. But the other large group of organisms that has specialized in the terrestrial environment is insects. Some insects have very high metabolic rates, they're very active, they're flying, they're jumping, so they need quite a bit of oxygen. They need to move that oxygen or from the air into and out of the middles of their bodies, but the way that their respiratory system works is that it's connected to the outside of the body surface of the animal. But these animals have an exoskeleton, right? So imagine that you're covered the outside of the body with a suit of armor that's waterproof, right? Which is great, right? So exactly like plant leaves that are waterproof, but then they still need to do gas exchange, so they need to have some little holes in them, right? So insects and other terrestrial arthropods have these holes in their exoskeleton. If you have a large grasshopper, you can actually see them. And those holes lead to tubing. right? So this system works very much like a ventilation system in a house where we have some vent up on the outside of the house. Maybe there's a little fan that's pulling air in from the outside, and it sends its down tubing and it goes into every room in the house. So these tubes are called trachea, and that's the same word that we use for the tube that connects our throat to our lungs. And the trachea are going to extend into the body of the animal. Now, their bodies still aren't tremendously large, but diffusion is going to be kind of slow to get the air and the oxygen from it all the way into all the body cells. So although the little tubes branch and branch and branch and extend to all the cells that need oxygen in the body, there's another way that the animal can cause ventilation to happen, right? Remember, ventilation is a way to force or move air into and out of this tracheal tubing system, right? So they have these air sacs. These air sacs work a little differently than our human way we get air into and out of the lungs. So imagine that you have one of those things that you can poof air into your fire in your fireplace with. You pull the handles together and it goes, and then you open it up and it sucks air back into itself, and then you push it together and it goes. Right, so these air sacs that are distributed throughout the body of the insect work the same way. As the animal is doing normal body movements, right, its muscles are going to squish onto these air sacs. That's going to force the air out of them, right? That creates a low pressure inside the air sac. And then as the animal's body relaxes, it allows it to draw the air back in again, because it's going to sort of spring back open and create a low pressure. Right, so we have a squishing of the air sac to push the air out of it, then it sort of bounces back and it creates a low pressure, which is going to pull the air in. Right, so we get this air flow into and out of this tracheal system. So because these tubes have to go all the way to the inside of the body of the animal, however, there's a maximum body size based on the oxygen concentration we have in the atmosphere now that constrains or limits how big terrestrial arthropods can be, right? We see these dioramas in museums of these giant dragonflies from the, ancient Earth, but there was a higher oxygen concentration in the atmosphere at that time, right? So you don't need to worry about, giant grasshoppers taking over the world, at least not right now. All right, so here in the arthropods, we have a slightly different system. We don't have, right, notice this, we don't have a separate circulatory system that's moving the oxygen to all the cells in the body. They're getting it delivered directly by the respiratory system. So this is a really different system. Now, arthropods do have a circulatory system. They have an open circulatory system. It's going to squish around the stuff, but everything else, right? All the other kinds of things that need transport are going to get transported in that open circulatory system. All right, our next system is the osmoregulatory system. So let's review osmosis to start with, right? Osmosis is a special kind of diffusion. Diffusion is going to be the movement of molecules down their concentration gradients. And osmosis is the special name for water moving down its concentration gradient. So we have to imagine that there are two compartments, right? One on either side of some kind of cell membrane here. So this dotted line is representing a cell membrane, a selectively permeable membrane of some kind, right? So it's going to allow water through, but it's not going to allow these solutes. So imagine that these solutes are some kind of large molecule that don't pass easily through a cell membrane. So if we think about what's happening to the water, even though the solutes can't move, the water can. So it's still going to want to go down its concentration gradient. And we have to think about this from the water's perspective, right? Because there's fewer solutes on the right-hand side over here, there's more water, right? So think of this low solutes as a high concentration of water. On the other side, there's more solutes. That means there's a lower concentration of water. And so the water is going to move from its area of high concentration to low. All right, so we're going to say that our two different solutions, all right, when we want to compare two different solutions to one another, we can either say they're isotonic. Isotonic is going to be if they're the same. Right? Or isoosmotic. If we have isoosmotic solutions, we don't have net water flow or net solute flow from one side to the other, right? They stay the same. But where we have different concentrations of water or solutes on each side, however you want to think about it, we're going to have one side that has fewer solutes, and we're going to have one side with higher solutes. So these terms, hypoosmotic or hypotonic and hyperosmotic or hypertonic, those are always used in comparison to one another, right? We wouldn't say that there would, if we only had one solution, we wouldn't be able to say whether it was higher or lower than anything else. You have to specify that second solution. Right, so the hypoosmotic side is going to have a higher water concentration, a hyperosmotic side is going to have a lower water concentration, or hypertonic is going to have a higher solute level of solutes, right? The way that I remember this, it's not amazing, but if you think about a kid who's eaten a lot of sugar and is bouncing around, we used to say that kid was acting hyper or hyperactive. And so I imagine all that sugar as a high concentration, and that helped me remember the hyperosmotic or hypertonic side has the high solutes. All right, so this is important because when we have organisms that are living in different environments, watery environments or terrestrial environments, and the way that water moves across cell membranes in every physiological process we'll look at later on is going to be important, right? But when we're looking at sort of what are the range of different environments that organisms might live in and what are their water problems, we have a very different problem if we're an organism that's living in salt water. Right? So we have fish. Now these are representing actual species of fish, but it doesn't matter that much because we have a fish that lives in salt water on the left-hand side, and we have a fish that lives in fresh water. Right? Fresh water has some solutes in it, but it's very, very hypoosmotic. Right? The body fluids of animals, even inside single cells, right? Cytoplasm, body fluids, are all about as salty as seawater. So freshwater habitat is always going to be extremely hypotonic compared to the body fluids of an animal that's in it, even a single cell. All right, so the problem in a freshwater organism is going to be water gain. Even if you don't drink any water, right? Some body surface, the gills for fish, right? They have to have all that surface area in contact with the water in order to get oxygen in. There's going to be water coming in as well. The whole lake is going to be trying to dilute the blood that's in the gills of the fish so that it's equally osmotic as the fresh water. And so what happens is that the fish are able to have a kidney, right? And they are just going to just pee a lot of water out all the time, right? So if you're in a freshwater pond, it's full of fish pee, I'm just saying. It actually has a harder time getting the salts that it needs, right? So it's going to get those from food. It can also pump some into its body through the gills, and it also is going to keep them, right? It's going to try not to pee away any of those important ions that it needs. So vertebrates, marine vertebrates, which is going to include fish, seabirds like gulls and albatross, marine iguana, other reptiles like sea turtles, marine mammals like seals and dolphins. They are going to have, over evolutionary time, dialed back the solutes in the body a little bit from seawater, right? So the seawater is saltier than the body fluids of vertebrates, right? So the problem in the seawater habitat is water loss. That is because the salinity level, the solutes of vertebrate body fluids, is a little bit lower than that of saltwater, right? So you're not imagining things when you come back from having spent a day at the beach. Not only was it hot and sunny and you were sweating, but when you were in the water, and that the water was pulling some fluids out from your body. So the water, the same way it's going into the gills of the freshwater fish, it's going to be getting sucked out of the body of the saltwater fish. And so it's going to be losing water. Now, ironically, the only water that it can get, right, it's stuck there living in the salt water. The only water it can get is salt water. And so saltwater vertebrates have to actually drink it. Right? In order to get water, they have to actually drink seawater. Now, humans, we're a terrestrial mammal or vertebrate, and we have evolved so that we don't have the same kidney functions that marine vertebrates do. And so we can't do that. But their kidneys are going to be able to excrete or get rid of these excess salt ions and retain as much water as it possibly can, right? So a saltwater fish is going to put very, very little water in its urine. It's going to pee very little. All right. Every other kind of organism that lives in seawater, all the worms, all the jellyfish, all the corals, all the other kinds of worms, all the echinoderms, all of the crustaceans, all the other kinds of marine organisms that are not vertebrates, right? So marine invertebrates, those marine invertebrates, they're basically all going to be isotonic to seawater. So they never evolved to have a different body concentration than seawater. They sort of evolved in seawater, and it's least work to just stay the same concentration as seawater. So most of the time, they don't have any kind of osmotic challenges. They're just hanging out with the same concentration as seawater, and they don't have to do any work in order to manage their body water concentration. All right, so when we look at organisms that live on land, they may live in a high water environment where they can readily have available water to drink as much as they need, or they may live in a desert environment. So we'll define a desert environment as one that's limited in terms of water. The amount that organisms need may not be available. There may be no surface water. There may not be any reliable place that they can drink, right? So these are going to be organisms that have to have adapted over evolutionary time to not need to drink water, right? So we'll look at the kinds of adaptations that they have. Some are behavioral. For example, a lot of animals that live in the desert are nocturnal. So it's cooler and moister at night. So they're going to avoid the heat of the day by living in a burrow or a tunnel underground. It's cooler and damper the further you go underground as well. So they'll prevent dehydration just from their nocturnal behavior. They're also adapted to basically not drink. They're going to get all the water they need from the foods that they eat. All the foods that they eat, plants or other animals, if they're a carnivore, has water in it, all right? Whatever, 90% of our body is water or something like that, 70%, I can't remember the exact number. There's a lot of, like our blood, all that liquidy stuff in plants, all their sap, their fluid that's being transported through their bodies is mostly water. The insides of cells are mostly water. So there's going to be a certain amount of water that actually exists in the food. And then we have this part on this figure called derived from metabolism. All right, so when we break down a glucose using cellular respiration, what do we get? We get carbon dioxides and waters. We get some other stuff. We have to put oxygen in, we have to balance this equation and whatnot. All right, this water, these are legitimate waters. And for every sugar, for every glucose molecule that came from a plant that this animal ate, right, that glucose is going to get broken down. We get 6 waters from each one. That is water that's inside the body. All right, so notice that they're getting all of the desert animal, this kangaroo rat, is getting all of its water from its food and then from metabolizing or doing chemical reactions that break down the food molecules. So humans are an example of an animal that's adapted to being able to drink water during the day. And so we have water that we get that's ingested in our food. If you eat a nice juicy grape or peach or whatever kind of fruits that you like, obviously there's water in that. We're going to break that down, get the water derived from the metabolism, but then we may also ingest liquids. All right, we're going to drink. Average humans need to drink at least 500 milliliters or take in at least 500 milliliters of liquid in order to survive, to have enough water sort of going through the body that it's functioning properly, but we usually drink a lot more than that. All right, so this liquid water we ingest. Where do we lose water? Well, when we are breathing, we're losing water from evaporation. All that water that's on our lung lining some of it will evaporate when we exhale. If we sweat, it'll evaporate from our skin. Our fecal matter has some water in it. It isn't bone dry and chalky, thank goodness, when we're passing it out. So there's some water left in it. We do pull back a lot of water from it, but not all of it. And then we pass additional water as urine, right? If you drink more water, you tend to pee more. If you drink less water, you tend to pee less. And you can tell the concentration of that urine is higher. If we haven't drank as much water, we'll be passing urine that's darker in color, more of an orange or tan color rather than that light lemon yellow color when it's well diluted. So you can tell if you've drank enough water during the day if your urine is light yellow colored. But look at the desert animal. The desert animal is going to pass very little urine. It still has to pass some water in its feces, and that most of its water loss is through evaporation. Right? Remember, it's hot, it's dry in the desert. So proportionally, it reduces the amount of water that's lost in the urine, and it has to lose some body water to evaporation because it has to breathe. Right, so there's no way around it. You have to have that moist respiratory surface, and if it's hot and dry, then water is going to be lost by doing that just ventilation. Right. We'll also see that the urine is chemical composition is a little bit different. That the animals who live in the desert have a slightly different way that their kidney works. They can concentrate molecules to a higher degree than most terrestrial animals, and that they also pass a molecule in their urine that doesn't take as much water. Right? So there's reasons why they're passing less water in their urine. We couldn't just do the same thing ourselves. All right, so another way that organisms can help manage their water is to not have to use water in order to pass extra salt out of the body. So especially in marine vertebrates, remember that the salt water is a little saltier than their blood, and they have to take in some water while they're eating. You can't be an underwater organism and eat something underwater without swallowing some water. So they're going to be getting excess salt. They'd have to use a lot of water that they would have to drink and replace if they were going to try and get rid of that excess salt by peeing it out. So many of them have evolved a salt gland, and it's basically a special structure that is going to concentrate salt, sodium chloride, into some kind of little tube or tubule, a little tube called a tubule. And that fluid is going to get passed to the outside of the body. In seabirds and in seals and sea lions, in sea turtles, these are actually near the eye. And so we can sometimes see this kind of crust of salt around their eyes. So they're sort of like tear ducts, but not quite. So we're going to, again, have counter current flow. We're going to have the blood passing by this tubule. Some fluid needs to get secreted into the tubule to get the flow started. But we're going to have this blood flowing with a high concentration of sodium. We're going to have a high concentration up here. We're going to have a lower concentration here. We're going to have a low concentration of sodium inside the fluid that's in the tubule. As it passes along, we're going to continue to have a concentration gradient. And so we're going to be able to accumulate with no work on the part of this gland. It's just by diffusion that this secretion, that this fluid, or these tears, if you want to think of them, is going to get saltier and saltier as it goes towards the outside of the body of the animal. So just another example, a special body organ that can be an adaptation to special environment. All right, so as we digest proteins and nucleic acids, that is, we break apart those molecules, use enzymes in our digestive system to break them apart into the molecular subcomponents that we want to use for other things, what ends up happening is that these amino groups get sliced off. So our amino acids and our nucleic acids both have these nitrogen containing or nitrogenous molecules. This amino group, once it gets sliced off, it's going to grab another hydrogen and become ammonia. And if you use ammonia for cleaning around your house, it has a warning label on it that says do not drink. Ammonia disintegrates cell membranes. It is no good to have floating around in high concentrations inside your body. You don't want to pour it in your eye or anything like that either. However, if you're in an aquatic environment, there's very low ammonia concentration in the water around you, unless you're living in a tiny little freshwater pond. So mostly these animals, as soon as that ammonia is made and it gets into their circulatory system, it will diffuse out of their body into the water, right? This does not work with your fish in a bowl, right? You have to keep replacing the water of your goldfish because it's going to be peeing copiously into its bowl. It's going to put ammonia out with the urine, out through the gills, and it will die. No matter how much you bubble oxygen in its tank, no matter how much you feed it, it will eventually poison itself with its own nitrogenous waste products. So change your fish bowl if you haven't done it in a while. All right. So if we want to not spend very much water to store and get rid of these nitrogenous waste products, then we have to use energy and do chemical reactions that fasten those amino groups onto other molecules that makes them less toxic, right? We kind of stuff them in the closet, right? So we can do this in two ways. There's two molecules that animals have the ability to manufacture. So we have enzymes that allow us to make these molecules. And urea is the most common molecule. You can see the structure of it. It's a fairly small molecule, it's a little toxic. We don't want to have this hanging around in our bodies for a long time, but we can store it for a while and not risk disintegrating. There's a much less toxic molecule called uric acid. It can be stored, it can be put into much higher concentrations in the body without causing any harm, but it takes more energy to make it, right? Look at all the chemical bonds there are in that uric acid molecule. We have to have an enzyme, we have to use ATPs in order to power the chemical reactions to bond all of those carbons and nitrogens together. All right, so we're only going to do that work if we need to. Now, we do produce some uric acid in our bodies, even though mostly we produce urea. If we want to retain, if you don't want to have to use a lot of water to get rid of our nitrogenous waste, however, we're going to use this uric acid. And we're going to see that animals use it predominantly based on their environment rather than on their taxonomic affiliation, right? So most mammals are going to use urea, but desert mammals are going to use uric acid, for example. All right, so what do we need to do if we're going to get rid of these waste products? We're going to see that in all different kinds of organisms, just like we looked at that example of a salt excretory tubule, all of these other metabolic waste products that are circulating in the hemolymph, in the blood, wherever they are in the organism, we're going to have an excretory tubule, a little tube, that is going to have a way to separate the stuff you want to keep and the stuff you want to get rid of. Right, so we see that there is a close relationship between in an organism with a closed circulatory system, that we have some capillaries that are in close association with the end of this tubule. Right, so these capillaries are sort of in this little ball, and the end of the tubule fits around them. Right, so just like we have capillaries right next to the respiratory surface, we have capillaries right next to this excretory tubule. Filtration is the first step. It's going to push some of the body fluid. Now, in our bodies, it's called plasma, right? So not the cells, but the liquidy stuff that's surrounding them of the blood. So we show in this figure that the capillary is red, however, the tubule is yellow. It's going to be urine eventually, right? It isn't urine when it's first formed. Urine is the final product. Just like when we pour a liquid through our filter, and we've got the filter paper in our chemistry lab, the stuff that comes through the bottom, we're going to call it the filtrate, right? Same thing here. We have done a filtration step. What have we kept behind inside the capillaries? We've kept the cells, all right? Also kind of like the coffee grounds inside your coffee filter, right? We've kept the grainy stuff, the cells, but we've pushed the fluid out. Now there's going to be a series of steps depending on the organism where we've got everything that was in our bloodstream in the filtrate. We want some of it back, right? There's stuff that got pushed in there that we don't want to pee out. We want to remove sugars, for example. We want to return them to our bloodstream so that we can get energy from them. There may be stuff that we want to get rid of more than is going to end up in the tubule. So we can also actively pump substances into the tubule to get rid of them. We might do this with some kinds of additional toxic molecules, for example, benzene. It gets pumped out of our bodies very rapidly. Right, so after we've done this editing, right, reabsorption and secretion, edit the composition of the filtrate. Once we're finished, it's the urine and it gets excreted outside the body. Right, so remember the direction that reabsorption and secretion are happening in is from the perspective of the bloodstream, not the perspective of the tubule, right? So reabsorption, where are we absorbing it back into? The capillary. Secretion, where are we moving it from? The capillary, right? Another way to think of it is the things we're secreting are going to end up on the outside of the body, right? We'll come back to this again when we talk about the vertebrate kidney or mammalian kidney, and we look in much more detail at a lot of these steps of reabsorption and secretion and how they work. When we look at all different kinds of animals, even from the most humble and fairly simple, we find structures of tubules that are used for excretion. So this is an example of a flatworm. This is our friend Planaria. So it's in the phylum Platyhelminthes. Remember, these are flatworms. Now, they don't have a circulatory system, but they do have an excretory system, right? It's very simple. It's just some tubules and a way to move the fluid in those cells, which is with cilia. So they're so small, they don't even have any kind of muscular contractions or anything. They just have some cilia beating, and it creates a current of fluid that allows them to move those substances out of their body. Now, this system is very simple, and it's called the protonephridia. All right, the main unit in our kidneys that do all of the excretory work are the nephrons. All right, so there's a whole bundle of nephrons inside the kidney. We're going to see that we have this very, very simple system. We call it a protonephridia, sort of a prototype. We'll see in our next organism that it's called a metanephridia. It's a little more complicated, right? The other thing that's fun to notice on these flatworms is that these excretory pores are all over the surface of their body. So they're basically peeing out of dozens of openings over their body. And in case you ever were thinking about licking a flatworm, this should be the last thing you need to know. That's not a good idea. This is a close-up of an earthworm, all right, from our phylum Annelida. All right, it has this body segmentation, right, these repeating units. So we look at every body segment, we see the same thing inside of it. Now, it has a structure for excretion and osmoregulation called a metanephridia, right? Notice that it's this little tubule, right? It's got a capillary around it. These organisms have a fluid-filled body space, right? This is sort of floating in that body space, and it's going to be able to absorb, the capillary is going to be able to absorb waste products that need to be passed on and transfer them into the metanephridia, right? Notice there's an opening on the outside of the body. We're only looking at one side, right? And so each body segment has a pair of metanephridia, a pair of tiny urinary bladders, and they are also peeing out of two openings on each body segment. The worms can have 100 segments or so. So again, don't lick the worms. All right, arthropods, again, have a really interesting and somewhat different body structure. All right, their body organ is these Malpighian tubules. So these green flowy things that are fastened to the outside of the stomach and intestine. All right, so remember that they have an open circulatory system. So this is for arthropods. And this example is specific to insects. All right, so insects have these Malpighian tubules. These Malpighian tubules are hanging into the fluid-filled body space. All right, so there's hemolymph surrounding them. Remember, they have an open circulatory system. So body fluids are just kind of getting squished back and forth. There aren't capillaries for them to interact with. And another different thing about the arthropod excretory system is instead of all these other systems where there's an opening to the outside of the body directly from the excretory tubule, some kind of urinary opening or many urinary openings, the excretory fluid is going to be dumped into the gut, right? And what happens in the hindgut, right? Notice this arrow showing that as food is being processed and it's moving through the stomach, just like in our bodies, at the very back end of the digestive tract. So we have a small intestine and then a large intestine and then a rectum. In the large intestine in our bodies, that's where the vast majority of the water gets reclaimed. Now we're going to pass some out with the fecal matter, but we're going to reclaim a lot of water. So remember that insects are an important group in the terrestrial environment. This is one of their adaptations to living in a terrestrial environment where water may not be readily available. They're going to dump this fluid that comes from the Malpighian tubules, right? They have to use some water to get the waste products dumped into the gut, but then some of that water is going to be reclaimed in the body. All right, so it would be as if instead of dumping to the outside of the body, our urinary bladder actually drained into our gut, and then we were able to reabsorb most of that water, and then we only passed one waste product that had fecal matter and excretory waste products mixed together. Turns out birds and reptiles do this. They only have one opening that drains from both their gut and from their excretory system. All right, so mammals separated those systems out from one another, but fish and birds and reptiles don't have those separate either. All right, so that is a water-saving process. All right, our last body system, thanks for, one more after this, immune system. Our second to last body system, the digestive system. All right, this one's pretty simple compared to the other ones. We have a tube that goes from one end of the body to the other, especially in most animals. We get food, we put it in one end, stuff happens in the middle, and the leftover stuff passes out the other end. All right, the easy vocabulary for these steps of food processing are ingestion. We're going to ingest stuff in our mouth. Elimination or excretion sometimes is also used for getting rid of the stuff, right? And then stuff in the middle is the important stuff. We're going to ingest, then we're going to digest, right? Digestion happens in two ways. Mechanical digestion is physical breakdown of the food by a macroscopic body structure, like our teeth, right? So mechanical digestion is primarily going to be done by some kind of chewing. All right, it could be in the mouth. Some other organisms have some kind of grinding structure that's not in their mouth. It may be further down in their digestive tract. So some kind of chewing or shredding that's done by a hard body part makes the pieces of food small. So the next step after mechanical digestion is going to be chemical digestion. Chemical digestion is done by enzymes, right? So we're going to start breaking down molecules, and we have to break down those large pieces of food into single molecules, and then we have to even break apart those large biological macromolecules. We have to break them down into their subcomponent part. So we break proteins down into amino acids, we break down complex carbohydrates into single sugars or double sugars. I can't remember the word for them right now. And we're also going to break down fats into their, we're going to slice off those fatty acid tails. Right? Those subcomponent parts are small enough that they can get moved across a cell membrane. Absorption is the step that is going to move those molecules from the inside, from the lumen of the tube of our gut. Right? There's epithelial cells lining the inside of that gut. Those food molecules have to pass through a cell membrane into a cell, right? And then get passed to the back-hand side of that digestive tract to the capillaries that are waiting to take that food molecule to the rest of the body. All right, so digestion is physical and then chemical breakdown, and absorption, that's the part where it actually moves inside of a cell in your body. Right, so as our food is passing through our gut, we may not completely digest, we may not absorb every single nutrient molecule that was in the food that we ate. All right, so some of that is going to pass out in our waste. There's actually quite a lot of cells, right? As the food is moving through our digestive tract, cells slough off or get scraped off from the inside of the digestive tract. So a bunch of our own cells get passed out in our poop as well. That is taken advantage of by scientists who want to know something about organisms living in the wild, and they can actually sample the poop and identify individuals based on DNA fingerprinting technology from their own cells. All right. Quickly, we have 3 reasons that we're taking food in the first place. We need to get energy. We need ATPs, right? And those are going to come mostly from carbohydrates, but they can also come from fats. We need to have enough energy available to fuel our metabolic needs for the day, to store for the future, to store into our muscles for future activity. We need to have these small molecules that we're absorbing into the body. We need to have, for example, amino acids. We need to use those amino acids to build proteins within our own body. Every enzyme that we make based on our DNA that is needed at any time in the body needs to be built and assembled from amino acids. We have to transport those breakdown products from our gut, right? So the building blocks, the molecular subcomponent parts, we get those from our food, right? If we're going to build muscle mass, we need to get additional amino acids from the foods that we eat. If we're starving, we're going to break down our own muscle tissue to use those amino acids for other things that are more important, right? So we want to be able to get those on our diet. There's also a handful of particular molecules, particular nutrients that we can't build ourselves. So we can take some kinds of amino acids and convert them into other ones, but we can't do that for all of them. We have a set of chemical reactions that our body is able to do. Those molecules that we need, that we cannot make ourselves, we have to consume in our food. So these are called essential molecules, Some of them are amino acids. There are other things usually that we call vitamins, right? Vitamins and minerals. All right. So let's look at how digestive systems work in terms of the structures that they have. All right, so we have very, very simple animals that have no ability to process food in any way. So starting with the simplest kind of organism, we have like our little hydra here. So I'm drawing a schematic. This picture on the right is a cross section through the cylinder of this body. Remember looking at hydra cross sections in lab. Now, it is an organism that has what's called an incomplete gut, right? It doesn't have a mouth and an anus. Food is going to go in the mouth, and then when it's digested and the animal's done with it, it actually has to squish it back out again. So you can think of it as not having a mouth or not having an anus, but it's got one opening that serves both functions, all right? Food in and waste out. This is a lot less efficient. Also, it has no ability to do mechanical digestion. You see a little hydra, it's going to grab some hapless, small crustacean. It's going to stuff it in its mouth. The crustacean is still going to be wiggling. Digestive enzymes are going to get secreted from the cells, and they're going to slowly break down that, that organism from the outside. Right. So like in a James Bond movie, when they, throw somebody in a vat of acid and they kind of disintegrate, that's what's happening inside this gastrovascular cavity. All right. Does the job, but we'll see that most organisms have more complex digestive tracts than this. All right. So what happens when you get a complete digestive tract? Right. A complete digestive tract is a one-way tube that goes from mouth to anus. And we see that very rapidly in animal evolution, we have developed job specialization, right? So there's different parts of this digestive tract that are going to do different jobs, right? What different jobs are there? Well, there's ingestion, there's mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, and elimination, right? So all these animals have an anus, all these animals have a mouth, some kind of tube that connects the mouth to a stomach. Right, a stomach is handy because it's going to be a little bit bigger part of that tube. It's going to allow food to sort of accumulate for a longer time. You can eat a large meal at once and then not eat for a while. And there's going to be parts, so none of these animals can do very much mechanical digestion. So they're going to have this structure called a gizzard. Gizzard in bird and in earthworm is a place where they're going to have some little bits of gravel or sand, and the mechanical digestion is going to happen there. In the insect, it has these extensions or pockets sticking out from the side called gastric ceci. These little pouches or pockets are ways that the organism can end up taking longer to do digestion. When we have food and we're eating and it's sort of getting moved through our gut, there's only so long it can stay in our gut before we end up pooping it out. It's like a conveyor belt. We eat new food, the old food has to keep going through. If food can get diverted into these little side pockets and more digestive enzymes can be secreted, then we can get more digestion done on the food and absorb more of the nutrient molecules from it than we otherwise could. So we'll see that many organisms also sort of have these little gastric ceci or these digestive pouches hanging off the main tube of their gut. And in all these organisms, water is going to get reabsorbed somewhere in the hindgut or the back end of the intestine. All right, so if I'm drawing a picture of an organism like a worm, and I want to represent from the side, basic body plan. All right, they've got a mouth, they've got an anus, right? And if we take a cross section, we're going to have the outside, then we're going to have the gut, right? We may have some kind of space in between those, but this is what we mean by a tube, right? Within a tube within a tube body plan, right? This is the basic, simplest version of the animal body. Remember when our gastrula is forming, that tube forms through the middle of the body, it becomes the gut. We sort of stretch that out, we have a worm, all right? So if you want to think of that as kind of the most primitive or simple kind of animal body that arose when multi-celled organisms, animals arose on the planet, that's probably more or less what it looked like. All right, so where we have organisms with different diets, we see that they have different adaptations in their gut to process different types of food. So it turns out that plant cell walls that are made of cellulose, right? Remember that from our plant lectures. Plant cell walls are made of cellulose, and animals, our whole phylum, do not have a digestive enzyme that can break down that cellulose molecule. All right. So herbivores, animals that eat plants for a living, herbivores are eating a diet that they can't actually digest, right? What happens with that? Well, they have a variety of adaptations that help them do that, right? One thing that they can do, and a lot of organisms have this, is that they have bacteria, mutualistic bacteria, right? Bacteria have enzymes that can digest cellulose, right? Now we have bacteria in our guts as well. We are omnivores, more or less. Even predators have bacteria in their guts, right? So some herbivores have taken this idea of having this mutualistic arrangement with bacteria or other single-celled organisms in their gut to much higher levels than others, right? And incredible success with it. All right, so plant matter is much harder to digest. It's going to take longer to digest the same amount of material to get as many calories and as many nutrients out of it. Simple difference between a predator or a carnivore on the left, or coyote. If we stretch out the gut, right, the gut of an herbivore is longer, food is going to stay in it longer, right? So the overall length is short for our carnivore and long for our herbivore. Notice also the cecum. Remember, the cecum is an outpocketing to the side, and food can go in there. It can churn around, ferment, spend longer, have digestive enzymes working on it, have bacteria living in this region. And if you've got bacteria in the main pathway in the gut, they keep getting pooped out, right? We actually have a vast amount of bacteria that we poop into out every, they have to keep growing, the bacteria. Right. So notice the enlarged cecum in the herbivore compared to the carnivore. Not only allows them to take even more time to digest, but it's a safe place for those bacterial colonies to live. They may also have much bigger, stronger, flat teeth to do mechanical digestion. They may spend a lot more time chewing than a carnivore does as well. All right, so the largest herbivores and some of the most, the biggest amount of biomass that we see in lots of ecosystem is large herbivores. How do they do it? How do they get so much nutrient out of their grass that they're eating that they can build all of that large body size? Well, they have a multi-step system. They have evolved. There's a group of herbivores called ruminants, of mammals, and they have a multi-chambered stomach. The multi-chambered stomach allows them to chew and swallow their food, let it sit in the first stomach for a while, get partly digested, then they regurgitate it or vomit it back up again, chew it some more, swallow it again, right? Let it digest some more. All right, so when you see a cow sitting around chewing its cud, it's partially digested vomit that they're chewing. Don't kiss the cows. And that same thing is true for a lot of these large herbivores we see around globally. All right, so ruminants are includes cows, deer, and sheep, and they are able to really extract a lot of nutritive value from their food that way. Other examples of herbivores, they may poop some of their pellets and then eat them again. So rabbits do that, for example. They're going to pass these green pellets that are the first time the material has gone through their gut. They're going to eat those again, and then they're going to get more nutrition from eating their own poop. Yeah, glad I don't have to do that. All right, our last body system. Now, in most organisms, we don't typically see that they have obvious large body organs for having an immune system until we get into the vertebrates. But all organisms, whether it's a bacteria, whether it's a fungus, whether it's a plant, is going to have some kind of innate immunity, right? And innate immunity is separated out from what vertebrates have, which is acquired immunity. We are going to come back to talking about acquired immunity later on in the semester, like I promised. And these are unique to vertebrates. All right, so we're going to come back to these. What we find is that our biggest defense against pathogens, against damage to the body, is the skin. Right, so when we talk about the actual outer body coating, it isn't just sitting there. It has all kinds of ways of defending. It provides an intact surface. So whether it's a cell membrane for a single cell, it's equivalent to the skin. It separates the individual from the environment, and it regulates what goes in and what goes out of the body. So an intact integument, or the skin body organ, is a very important component of this innate immunity. So innate immunity is things that are basically built in, right? We're going to have, for live cells, they're going to have mucus on the surface of them. That mucus is slightly acidic. It's going to help discourage the growth of bacteria. Secretions like sweat, it's also going to be slightly acidic. It's going to help discourage the growth of bacteria, not just humans, but other organisms. Earthworm mucus is slightly acidic. It's going to help protect the body. We also have a molecule called lysozyme that is secreted in the saliva, in the sweat, in our various mucous membranes, and it actually attacks and breaks down the cell walls of bacteria. So we have these sort of general purpose bacteria discouraging functions that are on all the time, right? They're protecting us all the time. Bacteria are going to be out there, right? If a bacterial cell or another kind of pathogenic cell gets inside the body, right? So we have these barriers, right? We're going to try and prevent those pathogens from getting inside the body. If they do get inside the body, then most organisms have some kind of protective proteins that are going to attack them in some way. If it's a multi-celled organism, it's likely also to have some kind of immune function cell, a phagocytic cell. A phagocytic cell is a cell that does phagocytosis. Right? Phagocytosis is a special version of endocytosis. They're basically going to eat the bacteria. Now remember, bacteria are much smaller than eukaryotic cells. Right? Now, the overall function of the immune system is to recognize what is us, what is our self, from what is non-self, right? Things that shouldn't be inside of us, and then to protect, destroy, defend from those non-self organisms. So an example of what a phagocytic cell does, and lots of different organisms have these. They don't work exactly like vertebrate ones do, but for example, echinoderms have phagocytic cells that are circulating in their bodies. Insects have phagocytic cells. So they're going to be able to detect and bind to, right? So the reason why this bacterial cell, and shown in purple, is sticking to the cell membrane is that there is a receptor protein. Right, that receptor protein on the surface of this phagocytic cell is going to have some kind of shape, right? Remember how enzymes have a certain three-dimensional structure that matches to their substrate, and they fit together like lock and key, right? These receptor proteins on these immune cells are going to fit like lock and key to some kinds of bacteria. Wide variety of types that have been encountered over evolutionary history by the organism, right? So they're pretty generic. They're pretty like, this is some kind of bacteria. I can recognize, I don't know, peptidoglycan, something like that, that we know it's a bacteria. They're going to bind, and then the phagocytic cell is going to do endocytosis, move those bacteria into the vacuole. They're going to bind that vacuole to a lysosome, which is a little vesicle that contains digestive enzymes, and they're going to break down, they're going to disintegrate those bacteria, right? Later on, when we come back to vertebrates, we'll see that the fact that they spit out this broken up bacteria confetti is important. But it's, well, once it's broken up, it's just waste. The cell is going to get rid of it. All right. So multi-celled organisms across all taxa are going to have the ability to protect themselves from pathogens, and not just by forming a barrier to on their outside, but also to be able to detect and destroy cells that have gotten, bacterial cells, other kinds of pathogenic cells that have gotten inside of the animal, even without the fancy schmancy vertebrate immune system, the acquired immune system that we'll talk about later. All right, that is a basic intro to major body organ systems in animals. We'll come back and talk about things in a little more detail, a couple more systems we didn't talk about in the next few weeks.